Hey guys, tonight we drift through the streets of São Paulo, where skyscrapers claw at the clouds and favelas cling to the hillsides like forgotten afterthoughts. Picture the rumble of buses, neon lights blinking weakly in the misty drizzle, and the sound of distant motorbikes echoing through narrow alleyways. We're stepping quietly into a city that never quite sleeps, a place brimming with promise, but humming with tension. And somewhere out there, past the glitzy malls and the concrete towers, a young boy named Marcos is just trying to survive. Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive this world, not without picking up a few tricks along the way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know your location and the local time you're listening to this. I love seeing how far our little community stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's São Paulo in the 1970s, a place of staggering wealth next to crushing poverty. At street level, the divide feels like a physical barrier. You can smell the exhaust from imported cars zooming through posh jardins, but take one wrong turn and you're swallowed by narrow alleys where children sell candy at traffic lights. Marcos Williams, Herbas Camacho, who will later become known simply as Marcola, is one of those children. His family's tiny house in the city's periphery is cramped, the walls thin, the nights loud. A radio hums softly in the corner, masking the occasional gunshot that rattles the neighborhood. From a young age, Marco sees how life stacks the deck. School is a place you go because the law says so, but even the teachers look tired. At home, there's barely enough money for dinner, let alone dreams. He learns to fend for himself. If he wants a pair of sneakers like the other kids, he has to figure out how to make it happen. Many people still think that childhood poverty automatically leads to crime. But is it really that simple? So what do you think? Was Marcos destined for the path ahead? Or could someone have changed his trajectory? By the time he's 10, he's already slipping through São Paulo's sprawling public transport network alone, eyes sharp for opportunity. He sells chewing gum at traffic lights, runs errands for older boys, and learns to read people quickly, who might help him, who might hurt him, and who won't even notice he exists. He's skinny, quiet, with a piercing gaze that unnerves adults. A neighbor later recalls that he was always observing, always listening, a child with a mind older than his years. But observation alone doesn't pay the bills. Marcos starts hanging around older boys who make money in ways no teacher would approve of. One offers him a chance to watch a corner for the police while they move product. Another shows him how to slip a candy bar into his jacket without being caught. The adrenaline is addictive. One day he's still a kid, the next he's part of the city's shadow economy. And the streets don't care if you're ready. They just keep pulling you deeper. He learns lessons fast. One mistake can get you beaten, or worse. The boys he runs with talk about prisons like they're inevitable, like going to jail is just part of becoming a man. Marcos listens quietly, storing every detail. He notices which leaders people respect and which ones are tolerated only out of fear. Even at this stage, he's thinking ahead, cataloging what makes someone powerful in a world where the law doesn't protect you. In the late evenings, São Paulo's skyline flickers in the distance like another universe entirely. Marcos walks home past the glowing windows of apartments he'll never live in. His shoes are worn thin, his stomach hollow. He's tired but wired, thinking about how to climb higher, how to not be one of the countless kids who disappear into the statistics. He doesn't know it yet, but the choices he's making now are setting him on a trajectory that will shape Brazilian history. By the time he's a teenager, Marcos's reputation has started to form. He's not the loudest or the strongest, but he's cunning and calm under pressure. That combination makes him valuable. The streets are brutal, yes, but they also reward people who can think 3 moves ahead. And Marcos has the kind of quiet presence that makes others lean in when he speaks. He's learning that power isn't just about fists or guns. It's about controlling the tempo of a room, even when that room is a dimly lit street corner in the outskirts of São Paulo. Many people still think that young Marcos was simply swept along by circumstance, but some former neighbors swear they could see ambition in him even then. What do you think? Was he a product of the system, or was he already choosing to shape his own destiny? Either way, as the city grew louder, more crowded, and more unforgiving, Marcos was getting ready to step into a new chapter, one that would eventually land him behind bars and change the entire criminal landscape of Brazil. Marcos is in his mid-teens now, and São Paulo feels like both a playground and a battlefield. The city is swelling in size. Skyscrapers rise alongside sprawling favelas, and opportunity hides in the shadows if you know where to look. Marcos has been looking for a long time. He knows which alleys lead to safety, which ones lead to trouble, and which ones can offer quick money. It's around this time that he graduates from small-time hustling to more serious work. One of the older boys he's been hanging around pulls him aside one night and offers him a job moving stolen electronics. "Quick cash," the boy says, smiling. Marcos doesn't hesitate. The streets have already taught him that hesitation is a weakness. He takes the job and proves reliable. Soon, there are more jobs, each one slightly riskier. One day, while helping stash stolen goods in a cluttered back room, Marcos gets his first taste of the law closing in. The police raid the spot. He's grabbed, cuffed, and thrown into the back of a van with barely enough time to process what's happening. For the first time, he experiences the sharp metallic bite of handcuffs and the cold, unforgiving echo of a holding cell. Many people still think that prison is a deterrent for young offenders. But is that really the case? So what do you think? Because for Marcos, it feels less like a warning and more like an initiation. The first nights behind bars are overwhelming. The clanging of metal doors, the shouted conversations, the stench of overcrowding. Everything assaults his senses. He quickly learns that survival in prison requires the same skills as survival on the streets. Observe, adapt, and never show fear. He stays quiet, avoids confrontation, and studies the older inmates. He notices how certain men command respect without raising their voices. They're not the biggest or the angriest. They're the ones who seem to know everyone, who can negotiate with guards and fellow inmates alike. It's in these early stints behind bars that Marcos begins to form connections that will shape the rest of his life. He meets other young men from similar backgrounds, guys who understand the raw deal they've been handed by society. They talk late into the night about the conditions they endure: overcrowded cells, inedible food, and guards who treat them like they're less than human. One man mentions how things could be different if prisoners worked together instead of against each other. Marcos listens carefully. The idea of unity sticks with him. When he's eventually released, he doesn't feel rehabilitated. He feels sharper. He's learned how to navigate prison, and he's seen the seeds of something bigger, a brotherhood that could protect its members from both rival inmates and abusive authorities. He returns to the streets with a new sense of purpose. Back in the neighborhoods of São Paulo, things haven't changed much. The poverty is still suffocating. The opportunities still scarce. Marcos dives back into hustling, but now he's looking at the bigger picture. He's not content with just making enough money to get by. He's starting to imagine systems, ways to create order out of chaos. One evening, while sitting on a stoop with a group of friends, he mentions the idea of forming a crew that could look out for each other, both inside and outside prison. One of the older guys laughs, calling it a pipe dream, but another nods thoughtfully. "It could work," he says. "If everyone followed the same rules." Marcos files this away. Rules. That's the key. The streets are full of violence and betrayal because there's no code, no structure. What if there was? What if the same discipline he's seen in the men who quietly control prison yards could be applied on a larger scale? Not long after, Marcos is arrested again. This time, the sentence is longer. He's sent to a bigger facility, one of São Paulo's notorious prisons, where the population is bursting beyond capacity. Here, the lessons come faster. He sees fights break out over scraps of food, inmates stabbed with improvised weapons, guards who look the other way or join in the brutality. But he also sees the beginnings of something different. Small groups of prisoners banding together, protecting one another, sharing resources. He's drawn to one such group. Men who talk about dignity and solidarity, even as they're locked away. They don't call themselves a gang. They're more organized than that, more disciplined. And they're the ones quietly negotiating with guards, arranging for better conditions, and making sure their members aren't victimized. Marcos fits in quickly. His intelligence and calm demeanor make him a natural ally. During a late-night conversation in the cell block, one of the older members explains the group's philosophy. "If we stand together," he says, "the system can't crush us." Marcos nods. He understands. These men aren't just talking about surviving prison. They're talking about changing the balance of power. Many people still think that these early alliances were just about self-preservation, but others argue that the seeds of something much bigger were already being planted. So, what do you think? Was Marcos simply looking out for himself, or was he already envisioning the network that would one day be called Primeiro Comando da Capital, the PCC? Either way, as he drifts off to sleep in his bunk that night, Marcos senses that his life is heading in a direction from which there will be no return. The boy who once sold chewing gum at traffic lights is now part of a brotherhood that sees itself as a force, not just in prison, but on the streets of São Paulo itself. The prison gates clang shut behind Marcos again, but this time he's no longer a frightened teenager. He's starting to feel like a part of something, even if it's still unformed. The group he's connected with, the one quietly earning respect across São Paulo's prison system, isn't official yet, but its members share a vision. They want to change the balance of power, to create unity where chaos reigns. The prison is a grim training ground, overcrowded, violent, and corrupt. It teaches Marcos lessons that no classroom ever could. He watches how guards exploit divisions between inmates, pitting one group against another to maintain control. But the men around him have decided they won't play along anymore. "If we fight each other, we lose," one older inmate tells him. "But if we fight together, we win." Marcos absorbs every word. He's smart enough to see the logic. He's also smart enough to know that unity doesn't come easy in a place where trust can get you killed. So he studies the group's informal leaders, observing how they build loyalty. They look after their people. They share food, smuggle in medicine, and make sure no one is left defenseless. In return, their members follow orders. One day, Marcos is asked to deliver a message to another cell block. It's not just a note, it's a test. He moves quickly and discreetly, dodging guards and rival inmates. The message gets through without a hitch, and when he returns, the older men nod approvingly. He's proven reliable. That reliability will carry him far. As time passes, Marcos begins to take on more responsibilities. He negotiates with guards for small privileges, helps mediate disputes among prisoners, and even oversees the collection of a small fund that members contribute to. This money is used to support families on the outside and to bribe guards when necessary. It's a rudimentary version of the system that will one day make the PCC a powerhouse. Many people still think that gangs thrive on chaos, but Marcos is seeing the opposite. Order is what makes them strong, and the more he learns, the more he realizes that these lessons apply beyond the prison walls. When he's finally released, he returns to the streets of São Paulo with a new perspective. He's not just another young man hustling to survive. He's part of a network that's beginning to extend its reach outside prison. He reconnects with friends from his old neighborhood, but now he's looking at them differently. Who can be trusted? Who might be an asset? He starts talking quietly about the group he's connected to, about how they take care of each other, about how they have rules that keep everyone safe. Some friends scoff, saying that rules don't work in the streets. Others are intrigued. One of them points out that the police are corrupt, and the politicians don't care about poor neighborhoods anyway. Why not make our own system? He asks. Marcos doesn't answer, but the idea sticks. Meanwhile, São Paulo is changing rapidly. The city's economy is booming, but the gap between rich and poor is wider than ever. Cocaine trafficking is exploding, and the profits are staggering. Marcos knows that whoever controls those routes will control the city. But he also knows that getting involved isn't a small step. It's a leap into a world where mistakes are fatal. He spends his days hustling as usual, but his nights thinking about bigger moves. He remembers the older inmates who talked about unity and strength. He remembers how they kept their people safe and made sure money flowed back to the community. He wonders if that model could work on the streets. Then, another arrest. This time, it's for armed robbery. Marcos is sent back to prison, but now he's a familiar face. The group welcomes him back, and he quickly picks up where he left off. The prison has changed since his last stay. The network is larger now, more organized. They're calling themselves Primeiro Comando da Capital, the first command of the capital. PCC for short. Marcos feels a surge of pride when he hears the name. It sounds powerful, almost military. He watches as the PCC's influence spreads from cell block to cell block, prison to prison. They have a code of conduct now, a set of rules everyone must follow. Breaking those rules has consequences, but following them offers protection and support. Many people still think that PCC was simply a criminal gang from the beginning, but others argue that it started as a survival mechanism. So, what do you think? Was it always destined to become a criminal empire, or did it evolve because the system gave these men no other choice? In any case, Marcos is no longer just a participant. He's starting to emerge as a strategist, someone the others listen to when tough decisions need to be made. He's learned how to speak calmly even when tensions are high, how to find solutions that avoid unnecessary violence. Those skills will make him invaluable as the PCC grows in power. On a quiet night in his cell, Marcos thinks about the future. He doesn't know exactly where this path will lead, but he knows one thing for sure. The days of being a powerless kid in São Paulo's periphery are over. He's part of something bigger now, something that's only just beginning to show its true potential. The days inside the São Paulo prison system blur together, long stretches of monotony punctuated by sudden bursts of tension. For Marcos, now firmly rooted in the PCC's growing network, this environment has become his classroom. He's mastered the art of observation, keeping his head down when needed and asserting himself at the precise moments that matter. Every interaction, every negotiation, every confrontation is an opportunity to strengthen the bonds of the organization and test its code. By this point, the PCC is no longer just a loose collection of inmates. It's starting to resemble a structured entity, bound by rules and purpose. Marcos watches as the leadership formalizes a simple but powerful manifesto: mutual aid, collective strength, and resistance against the oppressive conditions of prison life. They collect monthly dues from members, small sums from those who have money, larger contributions from those running operations outside. These funds support families, buy food and supplies for inmates, and grease the palms of prison guards when necessary. Marcos's role grows organically. He's not a loud, aggressive leader. Instead, he wins trust through consistency. When a conflict breaks out between two members over a stolen stash, it's Marcos who steps in to mediate. He doesn't yell. He listens, weighs the facts, and delivers a solution that both sides can live with. One guard later mutters that Marcos has the patience of a priest, but there's steel underneath that calm demeanor. He makes it clear that breaking the PCC's code will not be tolerated. It's during this period that Marcos begins to develop a reputation for thinking several steps ahead. When rumors swirl that a rival gang might attack one of the PCC's members, he quietly arranges for extra protection. When guards threaten to cut off privileges, he brokers a deal that keeps essential supplies flowing. Many people still think that leaders in prison gangs rise simply through violence, but Marcos demonstrates that strategy and diplomacy are just as valuable as muscle. The prison itself is a microcosm of São Paulo's wider social inequalities. Inmates are crammed into filthy cells, with little access to medical care or even basic hygiene. Marcos witnesses fellow prisoners die from preventable illnesses, their pleas for help ignored. He understands why so many inmates are eager to join the PCC. It's not just about crime, it's about dignity. "We take care of our own," one member says quietly, handing a new recruit a bar of soap and a small portion of food. This philosophy resonates deeply with Marcos. He's seen firsthand how abandonment by the state creates fertile ground for criminal networks. He begins to think about how the PCC's structure could be expanded beyond the prison walls, not just for profit, but for protection. After all, the same systemic neglect exists on the outside. One day, Marcos is called into a meeting with senior members. They're worried about increasing pressure from rival gangs and from the authorities. The question on the table: how can the PCC grow strong enough to withstand attacks on multiple fronts? Marcos listens quietly before offering his view. "We need to be one voice," he says, "inside and outside. If we don't, they'll divide us." His words carry weight. Within months, the PCC begins consolidating its connections on the streets. Members who are released from prison receive instructions to build networks in their neighborhoods, collecting dues and spreading the group's message. The prison leadership maintains control through coded letters and messages smuggled out during visits. It's a delicate system, but it works. Meanwhile, Marcos's own life is still confined to the narrow world of prison cells and recreation yards. He spends much of his free time reading anything he can get his hands on: philosophy, history, political theory. Other inmates tease him for being the professor, but he doesn't mind. He knows knowledge is power, and he's determined to be more than just another man lost in the system. At night, lying on his thin mattress, Marcos thinks about the future. He dreams of building something that will endure long after individual leaders come and go. Many people still think that the PCC was built purely on greed, but Marcos believes in something deeper: order. And in a country where chaos often rules, that idea is magnetic. Then comes another turning point. A fellow inmate is beaten to death by guards during a routine search. The incident sparks outrage, and talk of retaliation spreads quickly. Some members want to launch an all-out attack, but Marcos counsels patience. If we react without a plan, we lose, he tells them. He proposes a more strategic response, a coordinated show of strength that will force the authorities to negotiate. His approach is adopted, and for the first time, Marcos sees the full potential of the PCC's unity. When the coordinated action takes place, it sends shockwaves through the prison system. Guards are caught off guard, and administrators scramble to restore order. The message is clear. The PCC is no longer a group that can be ignored or suppressed at will. Many people still think that the prison uprisings of this era were mindless violence, but those on the inside know they were carefully calculated. Marcos is emerging as one of the architects of that calculation, a young man whose quiet leadership is shaping the trajectory of a movement that will soon reach far beyond the bars. As he lies awake in his cell that night, the sounds of the prison settling into uneasy silence around him, Marcos feels a sense of purpose. He's no longer just a survivor. He's a builder, laying the foundations of something larger than himself. And he knows the time is coming when the PCC will be ready to test its strength on the outside world. The following months in prison cement Marcos's position as someone to be watched, not just by the authorities, but by his peers. He's young, but his way of speaking, his ability to de-escalate violence, and his knack for long-term thinking separate him from the others. By now, everyone knows the name PCC, Primeiro Comando da Capital, and Marcos is increasingly seen as a core part of its leadership fabric. The prison's walls, lined with chipped paint and rusting iron bars, feel less oppressive to him now. He's learned how to turn this place into an advantage. In some ways, prison has become the PCC's corporate headquarters. Inside, there are no distractions from São Paulo's sprawling streets, no illusions about the state protecting its citizens. Here, plans can be drawn, alliances can be forged, and discipline can be enforced. The PCC's membership continues to grow. Marcos watches as new recruits filter into the cell blocks, wide-eyed and hungry. They're quickly schooled in the group's rules. Respect your brothers, don't betray the collective, and contribute to the monthly fund. Breaking these rules carries swift consequences. Marcos is part of the council that decides those consequences. He doesn't enjoy punishment, but he believes it's necessary. Without order, we're nothing, he tells a hesitant younger member. One day, a serious issue lands on his desk. Figuratively speaking, a member has been caught stealing from the collective fund. Some leaders want to execute him as a warning. Marcos suggests another path: banishment. Killing him sends a message, but it also breeds resentment, he explains. If we exile him, he becomes an example without spilling blood. The council listens and agrees. Many people still think gangs thrive on senseless violence. But Marcos is demonstrating that calculated choices keep the PCC stronger in the long run. The system they've built inside the prisons begins to extend its roots into São Paulo's neighborhoods. Former inmates returning to their communities bring the PCC's structure with them. They start collecting dues, enforcing codes of conduct, and quietly controlling the local drug trade. Marcos and the other leaders receive regular updates through smuggled notes and carefully worded letters. It's not glamorous, but it works. Outside the prison, the streets are buzzing with rumors. Some residents in poor neighborhoods welcome the PCC's presence, claiming the group brings a strange sort of order. Others live in fear, knowing that crossing the organization could mean losing everything. Scholars and journalists debate the group's true nature. Are they a criminal empire or a social movement? One commentator asks on a late-night news program. Many people still think the PCC's influence is exaggerated, but those who live in its shadow know better. Back inside, Marcos continues to devour books. Philosophy, sociology, even business strategy. He's fascinated by leaders who shaped history, by revolutions that toppled systems, by thinkers who questioned the status quo. His cellmates joke that he'll be running a university one day, but Marcos is building a different kind of institution. He's convinced that the PCC must be more than a gang. It has to be a force capable of outlasting individual leaders. The authorities, meanwhile, are struggling to contain the group's growth. Transfers and solitary confinement are used to break up its leadership, but the PCC adapts. Marcos understands that decentralization is the key to survival. No one man should be irreplaceable, he tells his closest confidants. If one leader is removed, another must be ready to step up. This strategy is tested when one of the senior leaders is abruptly transferred to a distant prison. Panic ripples through the ranks, but Marcos remains calm. He quickly reassures everyone that the structure is strong enough to withstand the loss. Our strength is in the collective, he reminds them. And he's right. The group continues to function seamlessly, proving that its foundation is solid. As the PCC's influence expands, Marcos begins to think about how to solidify its reputation. He knows that perception is power. If authorities believe the group can strike at will, they'll tread more carefully. If communities believe the PCC is their only source of stability, they'll be more likely to support it. These thoughts swirl in his mind as he walks the yard, watching the sky darken behind the prison walls. One evening, he is called into a meeting where the leadership discusses the possibility of a coordinated action across multiple prisons. The goal? To show the state that the PCC can't be ignored. Marcos listens as plans are laid out, weighing the risks. A misstep could lead to a brutal crackdown, but the potential reward, greater bargaining power, is hard to ignore. Many people still think that the PCC's rise was inevitable, but from Marcos's perspective, it's a fragile project that could collapse at any moment. He knows they must strike the right balance between force and restraint. Too much violence, and they'll invite annihilation. Too little, and they'll be seen as weak. Late at night, Marcos lies on his bunk, thinking about the decisions ahead. He remembers his childhood in São Paulo's periphery, the hunger, the sense of invisibility. Those memories fuel his determination. He's not just surviving anymore. He's shaping something that could change Brazil's power dynamics forever. And as the prison settles into its usual uneasy silence, Marcos knows one thing for certain. The PCC's next move will define its future, and his own. The air in the prison feels charged as whispers of a large-scale action spread among the inmates. Marcos knows that something significant is brewing, but he's careful not to feed the tension. He has learned that in this environment, panic is contagious, and once it sets in, control slips away. Instead, he moves calmly from group to group, reassuring members, reinforcing the PCC's code, and making sure everyone understands their role. This moment has been building for months. The leadership has decided to stage simultaneous uprisings across multiple facilities, a coordinated show of power that will send a message not just to the guards and prison administrators, but to the Brazilian state itself. It's a bold move, one that could either cement the PCC's reputation or bring a devastating crackdown. Marcos is aware of the stakes. Planning the action is no small feat. Messages must be smuggled between prisons without detection. Instructions must be precise, and everyone must be disciplined enough to execute the plan on schedule. Marcos takes part in drafting those instructions, making sure they are clear and concise. If we move as one, he tells the group, they can't crush us. But if anyone breaks formation, we all pay the price. The day arrives, and the atmosphere inside the prison is thick with anticipation. Guards sense that something is off, but they're used to a certain level of tension and don't pick up on the full scope of what's about to happen. At a predetermined signal, inmates across the facility rise up. Cells are barricaded, guards are overpowered, and demands are issued. News trickles in that the same thing is happening in other prisons at the same time. The authorities are stunned. The Brazilian prison system, long thought to be firmly under the state's control, is suddenly paralyzed. Negotiators are brought in, and Marcos watches from a distance as the leadership articulates their demands: improved conditions, an end to abuses by guards, and better treatment for inmates' families. Many people still think these uprisings were purely about power, but insiders know they were also about dignity. Marcos plays his part carefully. He helps keep the younger members calm, reminding them that rash actions could trigger a violent response. He ensures that the PCC's code is enforced. No unnecessary bloodshed. No harm to hostages unless absolutely necessary. This discipline shocks the authorities, who are used to chaotic outbursts from inmates. When the standoff eventually ends, the PCC has demonstrated its ability to coordinate on a massive scale. While the state regains control of the prisons, it's clear that the balance of power has shifted. Guards are now more cautious, administrators more willing to negotiate. The PCC's reputation has grown exponentially. Marcos knows the risks have also grown. The authorities begin transferring suspected leaders to different prisons in an effort to break up the network. Marcos is moved to a distant facility, but the PCC's structure is designed to withstand such disruptions. Through smuggled notes and coded phone calls, communication continues. No man is bigger than the collective, Marcos reminds his brothers, echoing the philosophy that has kept the group strong. Back on the streets of São Paulo, the PCC's influence is expanding just as rapidly. Former inmates are establishing neighborhood cells, building financial operations, and quietly asserting control over the local drug trade. In some communities, residents begin to see the PCC as a stabilizing force, stepping in where the state has failed. They provide basic aid to families, resolve disputes, and even enforce a kind of street-level justice. Scholars and journalists take notice. Many people still think the PCC is just another criminal gang, but others are starting to call it something different: a parallel power structure, one that challenges the state's monopoly on authority. It's like a shadow government, one academic remarks in a televised debate. They're filling gaps left by systemic neglect. Marcos, meanwhile, continues to read voraciously. He studies revolutionary leaders and political theorists, drawing lessons from history. He's fascinated by movements that started small and grew to reshape entire nations. These stories resonate with him, reinforcing his belief that the PCC must be built to last. One evening, he sits in his cell reflecting on the uprising. He knows it has put the group on the radar in a way it has never been before. The authorities will be watching more closely, and any misstep could bring overwhelming retaliation. But he also knows that the demonstration of unity has made the PCC stronger than ever. Many people still think that power in this world comes solely from violence, but Marcos sees it differently. True power, he believes, comes from legitimacy. The belief, shared by members and communities alike, that the PCC is necessary. And as long as that belief holds, no prison walls can contain its influence. That night, as the prison settles into uneasy silence, Marcos senses a shift. The boy who once hustled candy at traffic lights is gone. In his place stands a man who understands the weight of leadership, a man who knows that the next chapter of the PCC's story will be even more consequential than the last. Marcos wakes the next morning to the muffled hum of the prison, boots echoing down corridors, distant shouts from cell blocks, the metallic clang of gates opening and closing. But something feels different. The PCC has crossed a line during the coordinated uprisings, and now the authorities see them not as a nuisance, but as a direct threat. Rumors ripple through the facility. New security protocols are being put in place. Leadership figures are being tracked more aggressively, and the state is planning to strike back. Marcos senses the shift before anyone says a word. He's been moved before, but this time, the tension feels heavier. Sure enough, a few weeks later, Marcos is abruptly transferred to yet another prison. This one is notorious for its harsh conditions. The guards make it clear that their mission is to break him. "No PCC here," one of them sneers as they strip search him on arrival. Marcos doesn't respond. He knows better than to show emotion in moments like this, but the PCC's network is too deeply entrenched to be dismantled so easily. As soon as Marcos settles into the new cell block, a familiar face approaches him. It's an old acquaintance from São Paulo, someone who quietly assures him, "We're here too." The PCC's reach extends even into the darkest corners of the prison system. Marcos quickly assesses the new environment. This facility is rougher than the last, with more rival factions and less tolerance from the guards. Yet the PCC still operates with discipline, collecting dues, supporting members, and enforcing its code. Marcos watches as disputes are resolved quietly and resources are distributed fairly. He understands that these small displays of organization are what make the group resilient. One day, a younger inmate asks Marcos how the PCC manages to survive constant transfers and crackdowns. Marcos gives a rare smile. "Because we're not just a gang," he says. "We're a network. Cut one branch, another grows." Many people still think that the PCC's strength comes from violence, but insiders know its true power lies in its structure. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the PCC is solidifying its grip on São Paulo's criminal economy. Neighborhood cells are growing more sophisticated, using coded communication and small business fronts to launder money. The group's influence stretches into the drug trade, controlling distribution routes and enforcing a tax on independent dealers. Those who refuse to pay are swiftly shut down. Some residents of São Paulo's favelas begin to rely on the PCC for services the state doesn't provide. They mediate disputes, protect families from rival gangs, and even hand out food and clothing. "They're like the government here," one woman tells a reporter, her voice tinged with both gratitude and fear. Many people still think these gestures are just public relations tactics, but others argue they're evidence of a deeper social mission. Marcos follows these developments closely through smuggled notes and encrypted messages. He knows that perception is crucial. If communities see the PCC as a stabilizing force, they're more likely to protect it. At the same time, he's careful to maintain discipline within the organization. "We don't rule through terror," he tells his fellow members. "We rule through respect." This philosophy is tested when a violent confrontation erupts with a rival faction inside the prison. Tensions escalate quickly, and some PCC members call for an all-out attack. Marcos steps in, urging restraint. "If we escalate, the guards will use it as an excuse to crack down on all of us," he warns. Instead, he arranges a quiet negotiation that diffuses the situation without bloodshed. Word of his leadership spreads, further cementing his reputation as a strategist. Guards notice too, and some begin to treat him warily, aware that his calm demeanor masks considerable influence. One officer mutters to another, "That guy could run the whole country if he wanted." As the months pass, Marcos continues to read and reflect. He's particularly drawn to books about political theory and revolutions. He sees parallels between the PCC and historical movements that rose from marginalized communities. This doesn't mean he romanticizes the group's criminal activities, but he believes that understanding power is essential to survival. Many people still think that the PCC's leaders are motivated purely by greed, but Marcos sees his role differently. He wants the organization to endure, to provide a form of order in a world where the state has failed to do so. That vision gives him purpose, even as he remains locked behind bars. Late one night, as he lies on his bunk staring at the cracked ceiling, Marcos reflects on how far he's come. He remembers the days of hustling on São Paulo's streets, the hunger, the invisibility. Now, he's a central figure in a network that stretches across the country. He knows the road ahead will be dangerous, but he also knows that the PCC is stronger than it has ever been. And in the quiet of the prison, as the distant hum of São Paulo seems a world away, Marcos makes a silent vow. The next chapter of the PCC's story will be even larger than the last. The new prison feels colder, not just because of the chill in the damp concrete walls, but because the guards here are relentless in their efforts to break any sense of unity. Marcos, however, is unshaken. He understands that prisons are designed to strip inmates of identity and hope, and he refuses to let that happen. Not to him, not to his brothers in the PCC. As he adapts to this harsher environment, Marcos begins to notice something. Even the guards here respect the PCC's quiet authority. They may sneer and bark orders, but they also know that the group can make their lives very difficult if provoked. The PCC has developed a reputation across Brazil's entire prison network, and Marcos is one of the figures behind that reputation. Every week, new recruits enter the system, and Marcos sees the same familiar pattern: confusion, fear, and the desperate need for protection. The PCC steps in to provide that protection, offering a sense of belonging that the state never could. This is where Marcos excels. He explains the rules to the newcomers with calm precision. We look after each other. We don't betray each other. We contribute to the collective. The simplicity of the message makes it powerful. Meanwhile, outside the prison, the PCC's structure is evolving. Marcos receives coded updates from the street through cleverly smuggled messages. They tell of entire neighborhoods coming under PCC influence, of businesses paying the group's tax without hesitation, and of rivals being pushed out of key territories. The PCC is becoming more than a criminal organization. It's morphing into a parallel system of governance in São Paulo's most neglected areas. Many people still think that this influence is achieved solely through fear, but residents in some communities see things differently. They're the only ones who help us, a young mother tells a journalist after the PCC delivers food to her neighborhood during a shortage. These gestures are strategic, of course, but they also tap into a truth that Marcos understands deeply. People will support whoever makes their lives better, regardless of legality. Inside the prison, Marcos continues to build trust. He knows that leadership isn't about barking orders. It's about listening, guiding, and enforcing the rules consistently. One day, a dispute breaks out over contraband. Two members accuse each other of skimming profits from a shared operation. Rather than allow the argument to spiral into violence, Marcos convenes a meeting. He listens carefully to both sides, weighs the evidence, and delivers a verdict that is both fair and firm. The guilty party is fined and temporarily demoted within the group's hierarchy, but not harmed. This approach reinforces the PCC's image as disciplined and rational, not just ruthless. The authorities, frustrated by the group's growing power, step up their efforts to isolate its leaders. Marcos is moved into a solitary cell for weeks at a time, with minimal human contact. The hope is that the isolation will weaken his resolve. But Marcos uses the time to think and read. He pores over books on history and philosophy, finding solace in the words of thinkers who faced adversity. One passage from Machiavelli sticks with him. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. Marcos reflects on this and decides the PCC must strive for both. The guards notice that isolation hasn't broken him, and some begin to regard him with a grudging respect. He's too calm, one mutters to another. Like he's always 2 steps ahead. Meanwhile, the PCC's influence spreads deeper into the cocaine trade. Marcos is updated on how the group has begun controlling entire supply chains, from the Colombian border down to São Paulo's bustling drug markets. This expansion brings immense profit, but it also draws attention from international law enforcement. The stakes are higher than ever. Marcos knows that with growth comes vulnerability. He stresses to his lieutenants the importance of discretion. "We're not invincible," he warns in a coded message. "One mistake can undo everything." Many people still think that the PCC's rise is unstoppable, but Marcos is acutely aware of how fragile their position can be. Despite the risks, he also recognizes the opportunity. If the PCC can consolidate its power, it could dominate Brazil's criminal landscape for decades. He begins sketching out long-term plans in his head, envisioning a decentralized network capable of functioning even if key leaders are removed. He's building an institution, not a cult of personality. Late at night, as he lies awake in his cell, Marcos reflects on the path he's taken. He remembers being a hungry boy on São Paulo's streets, invisible to the world. Now, his decisions ripple far beyond the prison walls. The weight of that responsibility is heavy, but it also fuels his determination. Many people still think that leaders like Marcos crave power for its own sake, but he sees it differently. Power, to him, is a means of creating order in a world that has always been chaotic and unjust. And as long as the PCC can maintain that order, he knows it will continue to thrive. The question, of course, is how long they can stay ahead of the state, rivals, and the inevitable fractures that come with growth. Marcos doesn't have the answer yet, but as the first light of dawn creeps through the bars of his cell, he vows to keep building, one decision at a time. The months that follow bring a slow but unmistakable change in the balance of power inside Brazil's prisons. Guards who once barked orders without consequence now glance over their shoulders before making threats. Administrators who previously ignored prisoner grievances now quietly seek out channels of communication with the PCC's leadership. Marcos observes all of this with a calm, almost detached demeanor, but he knows these subtle shifts are the result of years of planning and discipline. By now, the PCC has achieved something unprecedented, genuine bargaining power. Marcos, though not always the man at the negotiating table, is integral in shaping the strategy. He understands that outright war with the state would be suicidal, but he also knows that if the PCC appears weak, they'll be crushed. "We hold the line," he tells his confidants, "not by shouting, but by proving we can't be ignored." The authorities, frustrated but wary, begin reaching out in quiet, indirect ways. Offers of improved conditions are made in exchange for peace. Marcos recognizes this for what it is: validation. The same state that once sought to crush the PCC now acknowledges its influence, even if only behind closed doors. But Marcos is careful not to let this newfound leverage breed complacency. He reminds the organization that the state's overtures are not concessions of friendship. They're strategic moves to regain control. "We must never forget who we're dealing with," he warns. Many people still think these backdoor negotiations are a sign the PCC is softening, but the reality is the opposite. The group is entrenching itself further. Outside the prison walls, the PCC's networks are flourishing. Former inmates are opening legitimate businesses as fronts for laundering money. Neighborhood cells are coordinating drug distribution with military precision, and the organization's monthly tax, collected from both members and independent dealers, is providing a steady flow of resources. These funds allow the PCC to support families, purchase weapons, and bribe officials when necessary. Residents in São Paulo's poorest neighborhoods continue to experience the group's presence most acutely. Some see it as protection. Others see it as domination. "They're like the police," one man says in an interview, "but they actually show up when we need them." Many people still think this community outreach is purely a cynical tactic, but some observers argue it's a genuine attempt to fill the void left by a failing state. Inside the prison, Marcos begins to sense that the PCC's growing influence could be a double-edged sword. The more powerful they become, the more enemies they attract. Rival factions inside and outside the prison system are testing the organization's strength, probing for weaknesses. One afternoon, news reaches Marcos that a group aligned with a rival gang has attacked a PCC member on the outside. Tensions rise immediately, and some leaders push for swift, bloody retaliation. Marcos, however, urges caution. "We have to be strategic," he says, his voice measured. "Every move we make is watched. If we lash out without a plan, we give our enemies an opening." This kind of restraint is what sets Marcos apart. He understands that leadership isn't just about exerting power. It's about knowing when not to. Many people still think that the PCC's leaders are impulsive criminals, but Marcos's approach is calculated and deliberate. Meanwhile, his personal life is a distant memory. He has family on the outside, but contact is limited and fraught with risk. Letters are scrutinized, visits monitored. He sometimes wonders what his life would have been like if he had taken a different path, but those thoughts are fleeting. The PCC is his family now, and he carries that responsibility with a kind of stoic acceptance. Late one night, He's awakened by the sound of a disturbance in the cell block. Guards are rushing past his door, keys jangling. He knows instinctively that something serious has happened. The next morning, he learns that a rival faction tried to spark a riot in another wing of the prison, hoping to disrupt PCC operations. The attempt failed, but the message is clear. The organization is under constant threat. Marcos convenes a quiet meeting with key members. They discuss how to respond, not just to this incident, but to the growing challenges they face. We can't afford to be reactive, Marcos says firmly. We have to stay ahead of them. His words resonate. Plans are made to strengthen alliances with other groups, tighten security around communications, and double down on community outreach. Marcos knows these moves will buy time, but he also knows the road ahead is only going to get more dangerous. Many people still think that the PCC's rise is a story of unchecked ambition, but for Marcos, it feels more like survival. Every decision is a balancing act, every success a reminder that failure could come at any moment. As the prison settles into another uneasy night, Marcos lies awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the cell block. He understands that the PCC has reached a critical juncture. Their next moves will determine whether they remain a dominant force or become a cautionary tale. The weight of the PCC's growing empire presses on Marcos's shoulders, though he rarely shows it. He has learned that maintaining composure is crucial. A leader who appears rattled will quickly lose the respect of his people. Yet he knows the challenges facing the organization are multiplying. Rival gangs, state crackdowns, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. One morning, a guard delivers a summons. Marcos is being moved again, this time to a maximum security facility known for its strict isolation policies. It's a calculated move by the authorities. They hope that by cutting him off completely, they can weaken his influence. Marcos doesn't protest. He knows that resisting will only make things worse. The new prison is bleak. Inmates spend 23 hours a day locked in tiny cells. Communication with the outside world is virtually non-existent. Guards enforce the rules with cold precision. Marcos is searched at every turn, his belongings confiscated. He's assigned to a solitary cell with a single narrow window that lets in a sliver of light. But Marcos has been here before, in one form or another. He understands that isolation can be weaponized by the state, but it can also be a source of strength if approached correctly. He uses the long, silent hours to think, to plan, and to read. Books are his lifeline, and he absorbs everything from classic philosophy to modern political analysis. Meanwhile, the PCC adapts. Messages are smuggled in and out through ingenious methods. Coded letters disguised as legal correspondence, signals passed through corrupt guards, even messages embedded in innocuous family photos. Marcos maintains contact with the outside, though the flow of information is slower and riskier than before. One day, a message reaches him with alarming news. The authorities have launched a major operation targeting PCC-controlled neighborhoods in São Paulo. Dozens of members have been arrested, and assets have been seized. Marcos feels a twinge of frustration, but quickly regains his focus. This is the cost of growth, he reminds himself. Many people still think that the PCC can't be touched, but Marcos knows that the state is capable of striking hard when pushed. He crafts a response, emphasizing the need for calm and cohesion. "Do not overreact," he writes in careful coded language. "We must show strength through discipline." His message is carried out, and on the outside, the PCC's street-level leaders heed his instructions. Rather than retaliating recklessly, they tighten their operations, making it harder for the authorities to find targets. At the same time, Marcos considers how to rebuild morale. He knows that fear can corrode the organization from within if left unchecked. Through messages to trusted lieutenants, he reiterates the PCC's founding principles: solidarity, mutual aid, and the pursuit of dignity for members and their families. These words are not just slogans. They are the glue holding the network together. Inside his cell, Marcos has little contact with other inmates. But when he does, his presence is felt. Younger prisoners look to him as a source of wisdom. He encourages them to read, to learn, to think about the bigger picture. "You're not just here to do time," he tells one. "You're here to prepare for what comes next." Many people still think that prison hardens men into criminals, but Marcos believes it can also sharpen their minds if they choose to let it. He embodies this philosophy, using every day in isolation as an opportunity to refine his vision. Then, unexpectedly, a journalist requests an interview. The authorities, perhaps hoping to humanize the system, grant it. Marcos appears on television for the first time in years, speaking calmly and articulately from behind bars. He talks about the conditions in Brazil's prisons, the systemic failures that fuel violence, and the need for reform. He doesn't admit to any crimes, but he doesn't deny the PCC's existence either. The interview sends shockwaves through Brazil. Many viewers are struck by Marcos's demeanor. He's not the stereotype of a hardened criminal. He's measured, thoughtful, and unnervingly intelligent. He could be a professor, one commentator says. Others accuse him of manipulating public opinion. Many people still think that giving him a platform was a mistake, but the interview raises uncomfortable questions about the state's role in creating the very conditions that allowed the PCC to thrive. Marcos, for his part, understands the power of perception. He knows that the interview has bolstered his mythos, making him seem even more untouchable. But he's careful not to overplay it. He doesn't want to appear arrogant. He wants to appear inevitable. As he returns to his cell after the interview, the guards eye him with a mix of suspicion and grudging respect. Marcos doesn't gloat. He simply files the moment away as another piece of the larger puzzle. Late that night, as the facility falls silent, Marcos lies on his bunk and reflects. The PCC is facing unprecedented pressure, but it's also stronger than it has ever been. The question now is whether they can continue to evolve, to stay one step ahead of the state and their rivals. And as he stares at the narrow strip of moonlight filtering through the window, Marcos makes himself a quiet promise. The PCC will not just survive, it will outlast everything that seeks to destroy it. The days in solitary confinement stretch on, but Marcos refuses to let them break him. He's learned to find structure in the smallest routines: reading, exercising, writing down thoughts in tiny coded notes that only he can understand. These notes, when pieced together, map out strategies for the PCC's future. He knows that every moment spent planning in this isolation could determine whether the organization continues to grow or collapses. Occasionally, a guard delivers letters disguised as generic legal documents. Inside are carefully constructed updates from the outside world. Marcos scans them intently, absorbing news about arrests, territory disputes, and money flow. The PCC has become a sprawling network, and managing it from a concrete cell is no small feat. But Marcos has prepared for this. He's spent years decentralizing leadership, ensuring that no single man, including himself, is indispensable. One letter mentions that the PCC has secured more control over lucrative cocaine trafficking routes, using alliances with South American suppliers to bypass traditional middlemen. Marcos knows this will increase revenue, but it will also bring heightened scrutiny. Money draws attention, he mutters quietly to himself, folding the letter and burning it in a small, hidden corner of his cell. Many people still think that wealth guarantees security, but Marcos knows it can just as easily become a trap. He pens a message back to his lieutenants. Prioritize discretion. Avoid ostentation. Build strength quietly. These coded instructions are sent out through a trusted channel, reinforcing the idea that the PCC's power must be exercised carefully, not flaunted. Meanwhile, Marcos's reputation on the outside continues to grow. The television interview he granted from prison has taken on a life of its own. Clips are shared across social media, dissected by journalists and academics. Some call him a criminal mastermind. Others portray him as a philosopher trapped in a broken system. Many people still think this duality is deliberate, but the truth is more nuanced. Marcos understands that public perception matters, but he also knows he can't fully control it. The state, embarrassed by the attention, doubles down on its efforts to isolate him further. Communication is made even more difficult. Guards search his cell frequently, confiscating anything that could be used to pass messages. But Marcos has built redundancy into the PCC's structure. Even if he were completely cut off, the organization would keep functioning. One day, a younger guard, clearly curious, asks him, "Why do they follow you?" Marcos looks at him with calm eyes and answers simply, "Because I follow the same rules they do." It's not bravado, it's the truth. He's always lived by the PCC's code, and that consistency has earned him loyalty that can't be bought. On the outside, the organization continues to refine its operations. Community outreach programs are quietly expanded. Food and medicine are delivered to neighborhoods the state has long ignored. Disputes are resolved through the PCC's own system of justice. Residents know there's a price for this stability, but many are willing to pay it. They keep the peace here, one shopkeeper tells a reporter. It's better than nothing. Inside the prison, Marcos reflects on how far they've come. He thinks about the early days, when the PCC was just a handful of men in a filthy cell block, dreaming of unity. Now they're a force that shapes the lives of millions, for better or worse. But Marcos also knows that the larger they grow, the more fragile they become. Rival factions are constantly probing for weaknesses. The state is developing new strategies to dismantle them. And within the PCC itself, ambition can sometimes cloud judgment. To guard against these threats, Marcos begins drafting a long-term plan for leadership succession. He's seen too many organizations crumble when a single leader falls. "We must be bigger than any one of us," he writes in a note that will later be shared with his closest confidants. Many people still think that Marcola craves personal glory, but the truth is, he's obsessed with the PCC's survival. At night, as the prison is shrouded in darkness, Marcos lies on his bunk and lets his mind wander. He thinks about São Paulo, about the neighborhoods he once roamed as a boy. He knows that the conditions that shaped him still exist: poverty, neglect, violence, and he knows that as long as those conditions remain, the PCC will have fertile ground to grow. It's a sobering thought, but also a motivating one. Marcos understands that he's playing a long game, one that requires patience, discipline, and a willingness to adapt. And as the first light of dawn filters through the narrow window, He resolves once again. The PCC must endure, not just for today, but for generations. Marcos wakes each morning to the familiar sound of heavy boots echoing down the corridor, the rhythmic clank of keys striking steel bars. It's a sound that would unsettle most men, but for him, it's background noise, a reminder of the environment in which he has learned to thrive. Isolation has become a crucible for focus, and in this crucible, he is forging the PCC's future. The letters continue to arrive, smuggled through a complex network of lawyers, bribed guards, and coded signals. Each one is a puzzle piece that helps him see the broader picture. Territory gains in São Paulo, shifting alliances with rival groups, international connections strengthening through trade routes stretching across South America. Marcos reads these updates with a measured calm. Many people still think that the PCC's growth is inevitable, but he knows better. One mistake, one fracture, and everything could collapse. One report catches his attention. It details how the PCC's influence has spread beyond São Paulo into neighboring states. Entire prison systems are adopting their code, their structure, their rules. This expansion brings opportunities, but also new complications. Local leaders interpret the PCC's doctrine differently, and maintaining cohesion is becoming more difficult. Marcos understands that this challenge must be addressed before it grows into a threat. He drafts a long coded letter emphasizing the importance of unity and consistency. "We are one voice," he writes. "Do not forget why we began." The letter is sent through trusted hands, eventually reaching PCC lieutenants across Brazil. On the outside, journalists and academics are struggling to make sense of the organization's transformation. Some argue it is no longer merely a criminal enterprise, but a parallel power structure, complete with its own welfare programs and systems of justice. Others dismiss this as romanticizing a violent gang. They may distribute food, one commentator says on television, but they also collect taxes at gunpoint. Many people still think the truth lies in one extreme or the other, but Marcos knows the reality is far more complicated. Inside his solitary cell, Marcos continues to read voraciously. He studies movements from around the world, learning how they maintained discipline as they grew. He's particularly drawn to examples where decentralized leadership allowed organizations to survive even when key figures were removed. "We cannot afford to be brittle," he notes in one of his private writings. The guards, who once believed that isolation would break him, are now wary. Marcos remains unflinchingly composed, and his mythos only grows larger. Even other inmates he never directly meets talk about him in hushed tones. "He's like a ghost," one prisoner tells another. "You don't see him, but you feel his presence everywhere." One day, a smuggled note brings unexpected news. A faction within the PCC has been accused of skimming from the collective fund. The breach of trust threatens to spark internal conflict. Marcos knows that how they respond will send a message to the entire organization. He writes back, instructing his lieutenants to investigate thoroughly and act decisively. "Justice must be clear," he says. "If we are seen as corrupt, we lose everything." The matter is handled quietly but firmly. The offenders are expelled from the group, their assets seized and redistributed. Marcos's message is clear. The PCC's code applies to everyone, regardless of rank. Many people still think that criminal organizations operate solely through fear, but Marcos understands that fairness, however ruthless, can be just as powerful. As he reflects on these challenges, He realizes that the PCC's reach has surpassed even his early ambitions. It's no longer just about São Paulo or the prison system. It's about Brazil as a whole. And with that reach comes the need for a new kind of leadership. He begins sketching out the idea of regional councils, semi-autonomous cells bound together by shared principles rather than direct orders from the top. The concept excites him. It would make the PCC even harder to dismantle, even if he or other senior figures were removed. But he knows implementing such a system will require careful planning. Too much decentralization, and the group could fracture. Too little, and it will remain vulnerable to state crackdowns. Late at night, as the prison falls into uneasy silence, Marcos stares at the faint moonlight creeping through the narrow window of his cell. He thinks about the boy he once was, selling candy on São Paulo's streets, invisible to the world. Now, his decisions ripple across an entire country. Many people still think that leaders like him crave the spotlight, but Marcos knows the opposite is true. The less visible he is, the safer the organization becomes. And as he drifts into a light, restless sleep, one thought lingers in his mind. The PCC must outlive its founders. The next few weeks bring a steady trickle of updates from the outside. Each coded message is a snapshot of a vast machine that Marcos helped build, but now must guide from the shadows. The PCC's networks in São Paulo are thriving, but their influence in other states is becoming increasingly complex. Marcos understands that when a structure expands too quickly, cracks can appear in its foundation. One letter warns of growing tensions in a northern state where a regional faction is beginning to act independently. They are reportedly refusing to send their dues to the collective fund and have started enforcing their own rules instead of adhering to the PCC's code. Marcos frowns as he reads the letter by the dim light filtering through his cell window. This is exactly the kind of fracture he has been anticipating. He writes a response that is both stern and strategic. "We are one body," the message reads. "Those who act alone will destroy us all." He instructs his lieutenants to open dialogue with the rogue faction first, but makes it clear that if diplomacy fails, the group must be removed. Many people still think that the PCC's unity is unshakable, but Marcos knows it is maintained through constant vigilance. Meanwhile, another letter brings news that surprises him. The state government is quietly floating the idea of negotiating again with the PCC, using intermediaries to gauge the group's demands. Marcos senses desperation in this approach. The authorities are dealing with a surge in violence and overcrowded prisons, and they know the PCC has the power to either calm or escalate the situation. He considers the options carefully. Negotiation could bring tangible benefits, better conditions for members, fewer crackdowns, but it could also expose vulnerabilities. "We cannot be seen as begging," he writes in another message to his lieutenants. "If we negotiate, it must be from a position of strength." At the same time, he continues refining the idea of regional councils. He sketches diagrams in his mind, imagining how semi-autonomous cells could operate under a unified framework. This model would make the PCC harder to dismantle, but he worries about the risk of creating too much independence. Too much autonomy could lead to exactly the kind of rogue behavior he's currently trying to contain. Outside the prison walls, the PCC's mythos continues to grow. Journalists write lengthy profiles about the organization, and Marcos's name appears frequently in headlines. Some describe him as a criminal genius. Others call him a terrorist. Many people still think that such coverage makes the PCC stronger, but Marcos sees it as a double-edged sword. The more attention they attract, the more resources the state will throw at dismantling them. One day, a guard whispers a warning during a routine cell search. "They're planning to transfer you again," he says quietly. "Somewhere even more isolated." Marcos nods, saying nothing, but the news is troubling. Every transfer disrupts his ability to communicate with the outside world. He knows the PCC can function without him, but he also knows his guidance is still crucial. The anticipated transfer happens at dawn a few days later. Marcos is handcuffed, shackled, and loaded onto a heavily guarded transport van. The ride is long and silent, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of a guard's radio. When they arrive, Marcos sees a bleak facility in a remote location. The message is clear. The state intends to cut him off completely. The new prison is even harsher than the last. Contact with other inmates is nearly impossible. Guards speak little and show less compassion. Marcos is placed in a reinforced solitary cell with thick steel doors and constant surveillance. But even here, he refuses to be defeated. He begins rebuilding his routines, focusing on mental clarity and strategic planning. Letters eventually find their way to him, though the process is slower and riskier. He learns that the PCC's street-level operations are holding steady despite his increased isolation. This reassures him. The decentralized structure he envisioned is working, at least for now. One night, as he sits on the edge of his narrow bunk, Marcos reflects on the PCC's journey. He remembers the early days of smuggling notes between cells, the first collective fund, the first coordinated uprising. Now, the organization is a national force, shaping communities and challenging the state's authority. Many people still think that Marcola is the PCC, but Marcos knows that's not true. He has worked tirelessly to ensure the organization can survive without him. And yet, he also knows that the state will keep coming for him until he's silenced. As the prison sinks into silence, Marcos stares at the faint glow of the surveillance camera in the corner of his cell. He knows he's being watched, but he doesn't flinch. "We endure," he whispers to himself, "no matter what." The air in the remote prison feels heavier than anything Marcos has experienced before. Every sound seems amplified. The echo of guard boots against concrete, the hiss of the overhead fluorescent lights, the distant clang of steel doors. Isolation has been weaponized here. Marcos knows this is the state's most deliberate attempt to strip him of his influence, to sever the invisible threads connecting him to the outside world. But Marcos does not panic. He has been preparing for this possibility for years. He keeps his mind sharp through books, though now they are rationed more strictly, and through the disciplined routines he has perfected. Morning push-ups, long stretches of pacing across his narrow cell, meticulous mental exercises to remember and refine every detail of the PCC's structure. The letters arrive less frequently now, smuggled through ever more ingenious methods. One, concealed inside the binding of a religious pamphlet, brings news of unrest in São Paulo. Rival factions are attempting to undermine PCC control in certain neighborhoods, and the police are escalating their operations in response. Marcos reads the message slowly, absorbing each word. He crafts a careful response in coded language. Stay united. Do not overextend. Focus on the communities that trust us. He knows that in times of pressure, organizations are tempted to strike out blindly, but that would only play into their enemies' hands. Many people still think that the PCC thrives on chaos, but Marcos has always believed that discipline is their greatest weapon. Another letter details something more troubling: a growing rift between two influential lieutenants. Both are powerful figures in São Paulo's underworld, and their rivalry could fracture the organization from within. Marcos knows he must address it immediately. He drafts 2 separate letters, one to each lieutenant, appealing to their sense of duty and warning of the consequences if the conflict escalates. "Remember why we began," he writes. "The collective must come before pride." On the outside, the PCC's community outreach efforts are quietly expanding. Food drives, financial assistance for families of members, even mediating disputes in neighborhoods where police rarely venture. These actions strengthen their base of support, but Marcos knows they also attract scrutiny. Journalists and politicians debate whether these programs are sincere or manipulative. "They're building loyalty through charity," one critic says. "It's just another form of control." Many people still think that the PCC's social programs are a facade, but for the communities they serve, the aid is very real. Inside his cell, Marcos reflects on the role perception plays in power. He understands that myths can be as effective as money or weapons. The more the PCC is seen as inevitable, the harder it becomes for the state to challenge them directly. His own image has taken on mythical proportions as well. Inmates across Brazil whisper his name, imagining him as a shadowy figure who can orchestrate events from even the most secure prison. Marcos neither encourages nor discourages these rumors. He knows that fear and respect are 2 sides of the same coin, but he also understands that if the PCC becomes too dependent on his legend, it could weaken the collective. He has worked tirelessly to create a system where leadership is distributed, where no single figure is irreplaceable. One day, he receives a rare piece of good news. The rogue faction in the northern state has agreed to reintegrate into the PCC's structure. Diplomacy, combined with quiet but firm pressure, has prevailed. Marcos takes a moment to appreciate the victory, but quickly moves on. He knows that unity is a constant effort, not a permanent achievement. At night, as the prison is blanketed in silence, Marcos allows himself a brief moment of introspection. He thinks about the boy he once was, hustling for survival on São Paulo's streets, and wonders if that boy could have imagined the life he now leads. Many people still think that leaders like him are driven purely by ambition, but Marcos knows that survival has always been his primary motivation. He also knows that survival alone is not enough. The PCC must evolve to outlast every assault from the state, every rival, every internal division. Marcos envisions a future where the organization's influence extends even further, where its code becomes ingrained in the communities it serves. As the faint hum of the prison's lights fills the cell, Marcos makes a silent vow. "We will endure," he whispers, barely audible even to himself. And in that moment, he knows that no amount of isolation can break the vision he has built, brick by brick, decision by decision. Marcos wakes to the sound of the steel door sliding open for the morning head count, the same mechanical ritual that begins each day in this fortress of isolation. He sits up slowly, stretching his arms as he hears guards barking orders further down the corridor. The isolation is suffocating, but he has trained himself to find structure in the monotony. Every morning is the same. Count, food tray, the faint smell of disinfectant seeping in from the hallway. But Marcos has always known that resilience comes from control, and he refuses to let the state dictate how his mind works. One smuggled letter finally reaches him after weeks of waiting. He recognizes the folded paper hidden inside a religious magazine. The message is brief, but carries weight. Violence has erupted in São Paulo after a police raid killed several PCC members. Communities in the periphery are tense, and rival groups are circling like vultures. Marcos reads each word carefully, imagining the ripple effects. He knows that moments like these can make or break an organization. He writes back with deliberate calm, using code only his lieutenants will understand. We cannot fall into the trap of chaos. Support the families. Strengthen the community ties. Respond, but with precision. Many people still think that the PCC only thrives through fear and retribution, but Marcos knows that long-term survival depends on trust. If they allow themselves to be seen as reckless, their legitimacy in the favelas will erode. Another letter brings news that the two powerful lieutenants who had been on the verge of open conflict have agreed to a truce. Marcos allows himself a brief exhale of relief. Unity, he knows, is fragile. He remembers the PCC's earliest days, when the idea of brotherhood was all they had to shield themselves from the violence of the state and rival gangs. Do you remember why we began? He often writes in his letters, reminding everyone of the collective vision. As night falls, the guards dim the corridor lights, and Marcos's cell is bathed in shadows. He sits on his narrow bunk, listening to the distant hum of the facility, and allows his thoughts to slow. He reflects on how far the PCC has come, from a handful of men in overcrowded cells to a sprawling network shaping the very rhythm of life in São Paulo and beyond. Many people still think this power has made them untouchable, but Marcos knows the truth. Every step forward carries new risks, new enemies, and new internal pressures. He lies back on the thin mattress, eyes fixed on the small slit of a window high above. A pale slice of moonlight filters in, casting faint patterns on the walls. His body is weary from confinement, but his mind remains sharp. He knows the PCC will face even greater challenges in the months ahead, and the weight of that reality presses on him like the walls of his cell. Still, Marcos believes in the resilience of what they have built. He has spent years ensuring the PCC is not reliant on any one man, even himself. He imagines a future where the organization's code and discipline outlast all the individuals who founded it, where the communities that support them continue to thrive despite the pressure from above. His breathing slows as he allows the room's silence to wash over him. Each inhale grows deeper, each exhale softer. The world outside his cell feels impossibly distant, yet he can almost picture it. The bustling streets of São Paulo, the families who depend on the PCC's support, the countless lives impacted by decisions made in places like this. Endure, he whispers quietly, barely audible even to himself. It's a reminder, a promise, and a prayer. He lets the thought linger as his eyes close. The hum of the prison fades into the background, replaced by the faint memory of wind through the trees, the sound of children laughing in distant neighborhoods. Marcos holds on to these images, allowing them to soften the edges of the world he is trapped in. And as sleep begins to overtake him, his final thought is a simple one. The PCC must continue to evolve, because only through evolution can it survive the storms ahead. The morning count ends, and Marcos sits silently on his bunk, legs folded, eyes steady. He is accustomed to the rhythms of isolation, but he knows he can never allow himself to become numb. Complacency is the enemy. Every day he sharpens his mind, rehearsing the principles that hold the PCC together: unity, discipline, and adaptability. These principles are what have carried them through countless storms. A letter arrives, this time concealed within a shipment of legal documents. The message is coded, but the meaning is clear. Police have intensified their operations in São Paulo. carrying out large-scale raids and seizing assets. Several PCC members have been killed. Rival factions are sensing opportunity and beginning to move in. Marcos feels a familiar tightness in his chest, not fear, but the weight of responsibility. He writes back with instructions designed to stabilize the situation. Do not let emotions dictate action. Focus on securing the families, protect the communities, avoid open war unless there is no choice. Many people still think the PCC thrives by lashing out violently, but Marcos knows that reckless retaliation would only justify more crackdowns from the state. Another update details a troubling development. One of the group's regional leaders has been accused of using PCC resources for personal enrichment. This is a serious breach of the collective code. Marcos knows that if this behavior goes unaddressed, it could corrode the trust that binds the organization together. He responds firmly. Investigate thoroughly. If the accusations are true, remove him. Justice must be clear to everyone. This echoes the PCC's founding philosophy that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the code. Many people still think fear alone holds the group together, but Marcos understands that fairness, however harsh, is equally important. Meanwhile, the letters reveal that the PCC's social initiatives in the favelas are expanding. They are providing food and basic health care, funding school supplies for children, and mediating disputes that the state ignores. These programs build loyalty, but they also raise the organization's profile. We must not mistake goodwill for invisibility. Marcos warns in a message to his lieutenants. The authorities are fully aware of the PCC's community ties and are determined to sever them. Journalists report that intelligence units are using sophisticated surveillance to track the group's financial flows and communications. Marcos studies these reports carefully, even from his cell. He knows that adapting to this new level of scrutiny will require ingenuity. At night, when the prison quiets, Marcos lets his mind wander back to the early days. He remembers the overcrowded cell blocks where the PCC was born, the simple dream of dignity and protection for those the system had abandoned. Do you remember why we began? He writes in another letter, a phrase he has used many times. It's a reminder to his brothers that their strength lies not just in money or territory, but in the belief that they are part of something larger than themselves. One smuggled note brings news that briefly lightens his mood. The rogue regional leader has been expelled and replaced with someone more trusted. The swift action has reinforced discipline and reminded everyone that the code still matters. Marcos allows himself a small, satisfied exhale, but he knows there is little time to celebrate. Another challenge is already looming. A rival gang is reportedly forming alliances with groups in neighboring states. Marcos understands what this means. A coordinated threat could force the PCC into a defensive posture, something he has always tried to avoid. He begins drafting a letter outlining contingency plans. We must strengthen alliances of our own, he writes. We must be proactive, not reactive. His tone is deliberate but calm, designed to inspire confidence rather than fear. As he finishes writing, the faint hum of the prison's fluorescent lights fills the room. Marcos sets the letter aside and lies down on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He thinks of the families in São Paulo who rely on the PCC for support, of the young members who see the group as their only path forward. Many people still think Marcola's leadership is about personal power, but in his mind, it has always been about survival. He understands that the PCC's endurance depends not on any one man, but on the strength of its structure and the loyalty of its people. He closes his eyes, repeating the same word he has whispered countless times: endure. It is both a command and a prayer, echoing through the silence of the cell like a promise. The following weeks bring more unsettling news. Through smuggled letters and coded notes, Marcos learns that São Paulo is simmering with tension. Police operations in the city's peripheries have grown more aggressive, leaving residents fearful and resentful. Rival gangs, sensing an opportunity, are trying to push into PCC-controlled neighborhoods. These developments are exactly what Marcos feared: chaos breeding vulnerability. He reads the letters carefully, pacing his narrow cell as he considers the options. "We cannot lose the trust of the communities," he writes in a response to his lieutenants. "Strengthen the outreach. Take care of the families. Resolve disputes quickly and fairly." Many people still think that the PCC holds power only through fear, but Marcos knows that legitimacy is just as important. Without the support, or at least the acceptance, of the neighborhoods, the group would be far weaker. Another letter brings news of a major breakthrough. A reliable contact in a neighboring country has agreed to facilitate access to international cocaine supply routes. This will strengthen the PCC's financial position considerably. Marcos allows himself a brief moment of satisfaction, but quickly refocuses. "Expansion brings scrutiny," he writes in another coded message. "Be disciplined. Do not draw unnecessary attention, but trouble is brewing on another front." An internal report reveals that a small faction within the PCC has been hoarding profits and refusing to follow orders from the central leadership. Marcos recognizes the danger immediately. He remembers the rogue faction in the northern state and knows how quickly dissent can spread if left unchecked. He sends clear instructions. Investigate thoroughly. Offer them a chance to reintegrate. If they refuse, remove them decisively. The PCC's survival depends on its unity, and Marcos will not hesitate to act when that unity is threatened. Many people still think that the group's cohesion is natural, but Marcos knows it is maintained through constant effort. Meanwhile, the authorities have begun a new media campaign framing the PCC as a terrorist organization. Televised press conferences show images of seized weapons and cash, while politicians vow to crush the group once and for all. Marcos watches the coverage through snippets relayed in letters, understanding the strategy at play. "They want to isolate us," he writes in response. "They want to make the public fear us more than they fear the state." The campaign worries him, not because of the propaganda itself, but because it can justify harsher measures. He has seen before how governments use fear as a pretext to expand their power. He begins drafting new contingency plans, outlining how the PCC can continue to function if key leaders are arrested or killed. At night, lying on his bunk, Marcos reflects on the paradox of his situation. The more powerful the PCC becomes, the more pressure it attracts. Growth is both their greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability. Many people still think that success makes an organization invincible, but Marcos knows that it often makes it brittle. He also knows that the communities where the PCC operates will ultimately determine its fate. If the people see the group as a source of stability, they will protect it. If they see it as a burden, they will turn against it. "We must never forget this," he writes in another message. "Our legitimacy comes from them." A final letter that week brings grim news. 2 PCC members have been killed in a police raid, and tensions are boiling. Marcos feels the weight of the loss, though he cannot show it. He responds with words designed to calm and focus his brothers. Honor them with discipline, not recklessness. We will not let the state dictate our moves. As he finishes writing, the lights in his cell flicker briefly before returning to their usual hum. Marcos leans back on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind already turning to the challenges ahead. He knows that the PCC is approaching a critical juncture. One misstep could undo years of careful work. Many people still think that Marcola is simply a criminal mastermind, but in truth, he sees himself as a custodian. His role is to safeguard the organization so that it can endure long after he is gone. And as the prison settles into silence, he whispers the same word that has carried him through countless dark nights: endure. The next letter that reaches Marcos carries a tone of urgency he has not seen in months. Coded in its carefully chosen words is the revelation that the communities where the PCC has historically held the strongest presence are now facing unprecedented pressure from the authorities. Military police are conducting raids nightly, and entire neighborhoods are living in fear. Rival gangs, sensing weakness, are exploiting the turmoil to recruit and expand. Marcos reads the letter twice, his face impassive but his mind racing. He knows that panic leads to mistakes. He sits on the edge of his bunk and begins to write a response. "This is when we prove who we are," he writes in precise strokes. "Do not abandon the communities. Support them, especially now. The state will promise them protection and then leave. We must be present." Many people still think that the PCC's community work is merely for show. But Marcos knows that true loyalty comes from consistency, especially during crises. Another letter informs him that the group's regional leadership has approved an increase in the community fund, directing more resources toward food, medicine, and financial assistance for families of members. Marcos approves the move immediately. "This will keep the trust strong," he notes in a follow-up letter. Yet he knows that outreach alone cannot shield them from the state's campaign. The authorities are deploying intelligence operations at a scale the PCC has not seen before. Surveillance technology, wiretaps, undercover agents. Every tool is being used to infiltrate and dismantle the network. Marcos's instincts tell him that they must become even more disciplined. "Be invisible," he writes to his lieutenants. "No unnecessary meetings. No careless communications. Protect the structure at all costs." The media, meanwhile, is in a frenzy. Nightly news broadcasts show images of heavily armed police patrolling the favelas, alongside footage of drugs and weapons allegedly seized from PCC operations. Politicians give impassioned speeches promising to eradicate the cancer of organized crime. Many people still think these speeches are sincere, but Marcos has seen enough to know that political theater often matters more than results. One particularly troubling report reaches him. A small faction within the PCC has ignored instructions and carried out a high-profile attack on a police station, killing 2 officers. The act has enraged the authorities and risks undoing years of careful strategy. Marcos's response is swift. He writes directly to the regional leaders overseeing that faction. "This was not authorized. Discipline must be restored. If we are seen as reckless, the communities will abandon us." He reflects on how far they have come from the days when prison uprisings were their only form of leverage. Now, the PCC's power is woven into the fabric of entire cities. But that power also means that any misstep can have far-reaching consequences. Marcos knows they must avoid being drawn into a cycle of violence that the state can exploit. At night, as the prison falls silent, Marcos lies awake, running through contingency plans. He knows that arrests of key leaders are inevitable. The state will try to decapitate the organization, believing that without its heads, it will collapse. But Marcos has designed the PCC to be resilient. Leadership is decentralized, decision-making distributed. We survive because we are many, he reminds himself. A smuggled update confirms that the unauthorized faction has been disciplined, their leaders removed from power. Marcos feels a quiet sense of relief. These internal corrections are never easy, but they are necessary. Many people still think the PCC is a monolith, but Marcos knows it is a living, breathing organism that must be constantly nurtured and pruned. He writes one final letter before the guards call for lights out. The state believes fear will break us, he writes. But fear is what binds us to our purpose. We do not flinch. We endure. As he sets the letter aside for smuggling, Marcos allows himself a rare moment of reflection. He thinks about the families in São Paulo who rely on the PCC's support, about the young men who see the organization as their only lifeline. He knows the stakes are higher than ever, and as the last echoes of guard boots fade down the corridor, Marcos whispers softly into the darkness, a vow that has become second nature. We endure. The following days bring a string of coded messages, each more concerning than the last. Marcos learns that the government has launched a sweeping crackdown, deploying elite police units and intelligence teams in an effort to dismantle the PCC's operations. Hundreds of arrests have already been made. Some of the group's safe houses have been raided, and caches of weapons and money seized. Marcos reads each letter carefully in the dim glow of his cell's single light bulb. He's not surprised by the crackdown, but he understands the danger. The state's aggressive tactics can disrupt operations and sow doubt among the rank and file. He drafts a measured response. Stay calm. We have survived worse. Focus on the communities that support us. Do not overreact. Many people still think that power comes from acting decisively in moments of crisis. But Marcos knows that sometimes restraint is the greatest display of strength. A subsequent letter details how the authorities are intensifying their presence in the favelas. Armored vehicles patrol the streets and helicopters hover overhead. Residents are caught between the PCC and the state, fearful of both. Marcos knows that this environment can either erode the organization's legitimacy or deepen it, depending on how they respond. He writes back, "Show the communities that we will not abandon them. Protect them from both rivals and the abuses of the state. This is how we endure." The PCC's leadership outside the prison has already begun implementing measures to adapt. Operations are becoming more discreet, communications more encrypted. Marcos feels a flicker of pride as he reads about these adjustments. The decentralized structure he has worked so hard to build is proving its worth. Even with senior figures behind bars, the organization continues to function. But another report brings troubling news. Rival factions are attempting to capitalize on the crackdown by poaching PCC members and moving into their territories. This threat is particularly acute in smaller cities where the PCC's presence is less established. Marcos considers the problem carefully. Reinforce the local cells, he instructs in his next letter. Send trusted members to strengthen their resolve, but avoid unnecessary violence. We cannot afford to alienate the people. Meanwhile, the state is stepping up its propaganda campaign. Officials hold press conferences announcing major victories against organized crime, displaying stacks of seized cash and confiscated weapons for the cameras. Marcos is familiar with these tactics. He knows the state wants to project strength, but he also knows that each victory often comes at the expense of ordinary people whose neighborhoods are turned into battlegrounds. Many people still think that the PCC's survival depends solely on money and firepower, but Marcos understands that legitimacy in the eyes of the communities is their greatest asset. He drafts another message emphasizing this point. The people must see us as a source of stability, not chaos. We must not lose sight of why we began. One night, a letter arrives with particularly grim news. 3 PCC members were killed in an ambush by rivals. Marcos feels the loss keenly, though he remains outwardly composed. He writes back to the surviving members in that region, "Do not act rashly. Strengthen your defenses. Honor their memory by maintaining discipline." As the prison settles into its nightly silence, Marcos lies awake, thinking of the broader war being fought beyond the walls. He knows the state is determined to crush them, and rivals are eager to take their place. But he also knows that the PCC's strength lies in its ability to adapt. Many people still think that the organization is a rigid hierarchy, but Marcos has designed it to be fluid, able to shift and bend under pressure without breaking. He reflects on the early days when a single transfer of a key member could destabilize the entire group. Those days are long gone. A final letter that week reassures him. The communities in São Paulo remain loyal, even as pressure mounts. Food and assistance from the PCC continue to flow, and residents quietly resist cooperating with the state. Marcos feels a quiet surge of determination. This loyalty is the foundation on which everything else rests. As he folds the letter and hides it in the false bottom of a religious book, Marcos whispers the familiar word that has become a mantra: endure. It is both a command to the organization and a reminder to himself. He lies back on his bunk, the thin mattress pressing against his shoulder blades, and imagines the city far beyond the prison walls, the bustling markets, the narrow alleys, the families trying to survive another day. He knows their lives are bound to the PCC's fate, and that knowledge steels his resolve. The next coded letter arrives hidden in a packet of legal paperwork. Marcos unfolds it with the same steady hands he has always had, though his heart beats faster when he sees the opening line. Escalation is inevitable. The letter describes how the PCC's rivals are aligning with smaller regional gangs, forming loose coalitions in an effort to challenge the organization's dominance. Marcos reads every detail carefully, then leans back against the cold wall of his cell. He knows that rival gangs see the state's crackdown as a rare opportunity to chip away at the PCC's power. But he also knows that reacting impulsively could undo everything he has built. He writes a response in meticulous coded language. Strengthen alliances with those we trust. Avoid unnecessary confrontations. Our survival depends on patience as much as strength. Another letter arrives the same day, this one from São Paulo, reporting that residents in several favelas are growing restless. Military police raids have left families traumatized, and some communities fear the PCC cannot protect them. Marcos immediately writes back, double the support for families affected by the raids. Be present. Offer solutions where the state has failed them. Many people still think that community outreach is an afterthought for the PCC, but Marcos knows it is their lifeline. He also receives updates on the group's finances. Revenues from drug distribution remain steady, but the increased costs of defending territory and supporting affected communities are straining resources. Marcos knows they must be careful. Do not expand recklessly, he writes in a message to the financial councils. Focus on consolidating what we have. One troubling report outlines how the authorities are infiltrating local cells using undercover operatives. Marcos is aware that the PCC's decentralized structure, while a strength, can also make it vulnerable to infiltration. He begins drafting a new protocol for vetting members and detecting potential informants. Trust, but verify, he writes in a terse note. Any breach must be dealt with immediately. At night, Marcos thinks about how the PCC's influence has become woven into the fabric of São Paulo's marginalized communities. He knows that every action taken by the organization sends a message, not just to rivals and authorities, but to the people whose lives are affected daily. We must be their constant, he writes in another letter. We must outlast the state's campaigns and the opportunism of others. Meanwhile, the government's media offensive continues. Television news flashes images of drug busts and seized weapons, framing them as decisive blows to the PCC. Politicians appear nightly, promising to restore order. Marcos reads about these announcements with a quiet skepticism. He has learned that the state often needs the appearance of victory more than actual results. Still, he knows the pressure is real. The organization must be careful to avoid giving the authorities any excuse for a broader offensive. He reiterates to his lieutenants, every action must be deliberate. Any mistake can be used against us. Many people still think that Marcola thrives on confrontation, but in reality, his greatest strength is restraint. A letter from a trusted contact in the legal world brings a glimmer of hope. Some politicians are beginning to question whether the state's aggressive tactics are sustainable. The crackdowns are costly and risk alienating the very communities they claim to protect. Marcos recognizes the opportunity this creates. We must remain disciplined, he writes back. If we show we can keep the peace where the state cannot, the pressure will ease. Another message from a regional leader reports that the rogue faction in the northern state has been reintegrated successfully after months of diplomacy and careful pressure. Marcos takes this as proof that the PCC's code still holds. Unity is strength, he writes in response. Remember why we began. As the prison falls into its nightly stillness, Marcos sits on his bunk and reflects on the journey. He remembers the early days in the overcrowded cell blocks, when the PCC was just a vision shared among a few men seeking dignity and protection. Now, that vision stretches across Brazil, shaping the lives of countless people. Many people still think that Marcola is irreplaceable, but he knows better. He has spent years ensuring the organization can endure without him. Yet he also knows that the months ahead will test the PCC's resilience like never before. He closes his eyes, whispers the word that has become his mantra, endure, and lets the darkness of the cell envelope him, already thinking about the next move. The first letter of the week reaches Marcos early in the morning, slipped into the hollow spine of a law book. It carries troubling news. The state is planning another wave of transfers for high-ranking PCC members to distant prisons, hoping to fragment the organization. Marcos exhales slowly, his mind immediately spinning through contingency plans. Transfers can disrupt communications, but they also risk galvanizing unity among members who feel persecuted. He drafts a coded message to his lieutenants. Prepare for the transfers. Ensure each leader's absence will not disrupt operations. Strengthen the regional councils. Decentralization is our shield. Many people still think that the PCC relies on a rigid hierarchy, but Marcos knows its strength lies in adaptability. Another letter reports increased tension in São Paulo's favelas. Military police raids have escalated, and residents are caught in the crossfire. Some communities fear the PCC can no longer protect them. Marcos responds firmly. Be present in those neighborhoods. Provide support and rebuild trust. The people must know we are their constant. He knows that loyalty cannot be demanded. It must be earned continuously, especially when pressure mounts. A third letter brings an unexpected development. A prominent politician has criticized the state's approach to combating the PCC, calling it unsustainable. Marcos reads the transcript of the speech with careful attention. He recognizes the potential shift in public sentiment. If we maintain order in the communities, the political pressure will turn on them, not us, he writes in a follow-up message. At night, Marcos reflects on the evolution of the PCC's image. Media outlets continue to portray the group as a violent criminal empire, yet in many neighborhoods, residents see them as the only source of stability. This dual perception is both a strength and a liability. We must not lean too far into either image, he notes privately. Fear without respect breeds rebellion. Respect without discipline breeds weakness. Another message alerts him to a brewing conflict between two rival gangs, attempting to challenge PCC control in smaller cities. Marcos understands the danger of allowing such disputes to escalate unchecked. He writes back, "Defend the territories, but avoid unnecessary bloodshed. We do not want to provoke a full-scale confrontation." Many people still think that violence is the PCC's default response, but Marcos knows that each act must be calculated. A final letter for the week brings a flicker of hope. The rogue faction that had previously refused to adhere to the collective's code has been fully reintegrated, and their loyalty appears genuine. Marcos is reassured. This proves our code is stronger than any one man's ambition, he writes in response. But he also knows that unity must be cultivated constantly. He begins drafting new guidelines for leadership transitions and dispute resolution, reinforcing the idea that the PCC is a collective, not a personality cult. We must outlive all of us, he writes in a message to the regional councils. Inside the cell, Marcos keeps his routines. He reads voraciously, focusing on history and political movements that have endured adversity. He meditates on how those lessons apply to the PCC. We are not the first to be hunted by a stronger force, he thinks, but we can be among the few who survive it. At night, the prison is silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Marcos lies on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on the paradox of his situation. He is locked away in near total isolation, yet his decisions ripple across an entire country. Many people still think that such power brings comfort, but Marcos knows it only brings responsibility. He whispers his familiar mantra, "Endure," before sleep comes. The word is both a command and a reminder, anchoring him in a reality where survival is the greatest form of resistance. The letters now arrive sporadically, each one a lifeline linking Marcos to the outside world. He has grown used to long stretches of silence between updates, but that does not make the waiting easier. Each envelope could contain anything: news of a setback, a success, or a betrayal. The first letter this week is blunt. A series of coordinated police raids has led to the arrest of several mid-level PCC operatives in São Paulo. Marcos exhales slowly, holding the paper in his hands for a long moment before he begins to think. Raids like these can disrupt the network temporarily, but if handled poorly, they can also erode morale. He writes a coded response immediately. Do not dwell on the losses. Focus on reinforcing the structure. Others must step into the gaps. Many people still think that the PCC crumbles with each arrest, but Marcos knows the opposite is true. The organization has been built to absorb these shocks. Another letter reports that one of the rival gangs, emboldened by the state's offensive, has launched attacks in neighborhoods traditionally loyal to the PCC. Residents are frightened, and the authorities have done little to protect them. Marcos's instructions are clear. Defend the people. Make sure they know we are still their constant, but avoid reckless retaliation. He knows that the community's trust is the PCC's greatest source of resilience. Without it, the organization would be just another gang. Our strength is not in fear, he writes in another note, but in the stability we bring where the state has failed. One smuggled message brings better news. The PCC's expansion into neighboring states is progressing smoothly, thanks in part to regional councils enforcing the code with discipline. Marcos feels a flicker of pride as he reads the report. The decentralized model he envisioned is working. This is how we outlast any one of us, he writes in a reply. No single point of failure, but there are challenges even within this system. Another letter details a leadership dispute in a distant prison. Two figures are vying for influence, each claiming to represent the PCC's best interests. Marcos knows that unchecked ambition can be fatal. He writes firmly, "Resolve this immediately. Our unity cannot be compromised. Remind them that the collective is larger than any individual ambition." At night, Marcos reflects on how the PCC has evolved. What began as a group of men seeking dignity inside overcrowded prisons has become a sprawling network stretching across Brazil. Yet he also knows that growth brings fragility. The larger we are, the easier it is for cracks to form, he thinks as he stares at the ceiling of his cell. Meanwhile, the state's propaganda campaign continues unabated. Television anchors proclaim that the PCC is weakening, that the recent raids have struck a decisive blow. Marcos has heard this rhetoric before. He knows the authorities need to show the public progress, whether or not it reflects reality. Still, he understands the risk. If communities begin to believe that the PCC can no longer protect them, loyalty will waver. He drafts another letter emphasizing the importance of being present. "Show the people that we endure," he writes. "Where the state fails them, we must not." Another coded message reports that the group's finances remain stable despite the crackdowns. This is a relief, but Marcos cautions against complacency. "Do not flaunt wealth," he writes. "We must remain invisible." Many people still think that power is best displayed, but Marcos believes true strength is felt, not seen. As the prison falls into its usual nighttime silence, Marcos sits on his bunk, organizing his thoughts. He knows that the PCC's enemies, rivals, and the state alike, are hoping to force the group into mistakes. But he also knows that patience and discipline will see them through. Before lying down, he whispers his familiar word into the darkness: endure. It is a reminder of the philosophy that has carried the PCC through years of adversity, and one that Marcos will hold until the very end. Marcos wakes to the sound of distant shouting somewhere deep within the prison. It is nothing unusual. This place thrives on tension, but his instincts tell him to pay attention. News tends to travel faster than the guards intend, and by the time his first smuggled letter of the week arrives, the picture is clear. Several PCC members in another facility have staged a coordinated protest against worsening prison conditions. The letter describes how the protest was carefully contained. No unnecessary violence, no rash moves. But the authorities responded with a show of force, transferring leaders and cutting off visitation rights. Marcos immediately drafts a coded reply. Do not let this fracture morale. Stand firm but disciplined. Every action must reflect the collective. Many people still think that protests and uprisings are spontaneous, but Marcos knows that they are strategic tools. Another letter arrives later in the week, hidden in a hollowed-out Bible. It reports that the PCC's rivals have begun openly recruiting in territories once considered untouchable. Their strategy is simple. Take advantage of the state's crackdown to lure away disillusioned members and frightened communities. Marcos leans back against the wall of his cell, reading the message twice. He responds with urgency. Reinforce loyalty in those territories. Remind them who has supported them in times of need. Be visible where it matters most. Do not allow fear to take root. He knows that these neighborhoods are the heart of the PCC's influence. If they lose them, the entire network could weaken. Another update brings mixed news. The PCC's international connections have successfully secured a more reliable flow of product through Paraguay, bolstering finances. But the same channels are now being monitored heavily by federal agencies. Marcos sends back a warning. Do not grow complacent. Diversify our routes. One weak link can bring the system down. At night, as the prison grows silent, Marcos reflects on how precarious their position has become. Many people still think that the PCC's size makes it invincible, but he knows the opposite can be true. Expansion brings complexity, and complexity brings vulnerability. A particularly troubling message arrives days later. A police task force has uncovered a stash house belonging to one of the regional councils, seizing large sums of cash and documents. Marcos knows that if the authorities can piece together those documents, it could lead to more raids. He writes back immediately. Audit our security protocols. Destroy any information that could compromise the network. Assume they will come for more. Despite these setbacks, the PCC's community outreach continues to pay dividends. Letters report that residents in São Paulo's favelas are still largely loyal, providing safe havens and refusing to cooperate with the authorities. Marcos takes comfort in this. He knows that trust is harder to dismantle than buildings or bank accounts. Still, he cannot ignore the growing pressure from the state. Politicians appear on television nightly, promising that the PCC's days are numbered. Marcos reads these accounts in the letters and considers the possibility that some of them might be right. No one is untouchable, he writes in a private note to himself. We survive only by staying humble and disciplined. Another coded update arrives just before lights out. One of the smaller rival gangs has attempted to broker an alliance with the PCC, offering to merge operations in exchange for protection. Marcos recognizes both the opportunity and the risk. He writes back, consider carefully. Alliances can strengthen us, but they can also introduce instability. Loyalty must be tested before trust is given. As he folds the letter and tucks it away, Marcos feels the weight of the organization's survival pressing heavily on his shoulders. He has designed the PCC to outlive any one person, but he knows his guidance still matters. The prison hums quietly in the dark, and Marcos whispers the same word he has spoken every night. Endure. It is both a promise to the organization and a reminder to himself. He lies down, staring at the faint light creeping in through the barred window, and imagines the streets of São Paulo, the children playing soccer in the alleys, the vendors calling out at markets, the communities that depend on the stability the PCC provides. He knows he cannot fail them. Marcos receives his first letter of the week in the usual way, hidden in a book that passes through a lawyer's hands. The coded message inside details escalating tensions in São Paulo. The police presence in the favelas has intensified, with nighttime raids leaving residents terrified. Some neighborhoods are now virtual war zones, and rival gangs are trying to take advantage of the instability. He reads the letter carefully, knowing this situation is a delicate one. He drafts a measured response. Focus on protecting the communities. Increase support for families affected by raids. We cannot allow fear to shift loyalty. Many people still think the PCC's influence is built purely on fear, but Marcos knows that real loyalty comes from being a reliable presence when others fail. Another letter reports that the authorities are transferring key PCC members to distant prisons as part of an ongoing campaign to disrupt the organization. Marcos isn't surprised. He immediately writes a reminder to his lieutenants. Our strength lies in decentralization. Ensure regional councils can function independently. We must show that no single arrest can weaken us. Later in the week, a more troubling update arrives. It describes a leadership dispute between two influential figures in a neighboring state. Each is claiming authority over operations in the area, and their rivalry risks dividing the regional council. Marcos knows internal fractures can be far more dangerous than external threats. He writes a direct response. Resolve this dispute immediately. The collective must remain united. Remind them that ambition cannot come before the code. He spends his nights in the cell reflecting on how fragile unity can be. Many people still think the PCC is monolithic, but Marcos understands that it is a living system requiring constant maintenance. He remembers the early days when they were just a few men in overcrowded cell blocks, bound together by a shared sense of purpose. That purpose must never be lost. Another letter brings a flicker of hope. It details how PCC members have successfully foiled attempts by rival gangs to infiltrate their territories. Residents in the communities remain largely loyal, refusing to cooperate with the authorities despite mounting pressure. Marcos feels a quiet pride as he reads this. They still believe in us, he thinks, but the external pressure is relentless. A subsequent update warns that federal agencies are increasing their surveillance on PCC financial networks. Banks, money transfer services, and even cryptocurrency platforms are being monitored. Marcos writes back with urgency. Tighten security. Remove any vulnerabilities in our financial channels. Diversify where necessary. One weak link could compromise us all. As the week progresses, another letter describes growing unrest among younger members. Some believe the PCC should strike back harder at the state and rivals, rather than continuing Marcos's strategy of calculated restraint. He addresses this sentiment in a carefully worded response. Our strength has always been discipline. Violence without purpose will destroy us faster than the state ever could. We fight when it matters, not when it is convenient. At night, the prison is quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional footsteps of guards making their rounds. Marcos sits on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the weight of every decision he makes. He knows that each word he sends out into the world can change lives. Many people still think that his leadership is about power, but Marcos sees it differently. It is about ensuring the survival of the collective, about preserving the order they have built where the state has failed. he whispers his mantra into the silence. Endure. He imagines the children in São Paulo's neighborhoods who depend on the PCC's support, the families who would be abandoned without it. That image steels his resolve. A final letter arrives just before lights out. It carries a simple update. The leadership dispute in the neighboring state has been resolved peacefully, and the council has reaffirmed its unity. Marcos exhales slowly, folding the letter with care as he lies back on his thin mattress, the faint light from the barred window casting soft shadows on the walls. Marcos knows that the challenges will keep coming. But he also knows that the PCC has never been stronger. Endure, he whispers once more, a promise as much as a prayer, and allows himself a brief, restless sleep. Marcos wakes to the echo of the morning count. Guards shouting names down the cold corridor, the clang of gates slamming open and shut. The routine is unchanging, yet Marcos greets it with the same calm determination that has carried him through every trial. He knows that consistency is a weapon of its own. A letter arrives later in the day, tucked into a stack of legal papers. Its coded message reports that the state is planning another series of raids, this time targeting PCC strongholds in São Paulo's periphery. Marcos reads slowly, weighing every detail. He knows that such raids not only disrupt operations, but also sow fear in the communities the PCC has worked so hard to protect. His response is immediate and deliberate. Prepare quietly, reassure the communities, be present during the raids, but do not provoke open conflict unless absolutely necessary. Many people still think that strength is measured by how forcefully one can strike back. But Marcos knows that restraint often preserves the collective far better than retaliation. Another letter brings news that federal authorities are increasing pressure on the PCC's financial networks. Several money laundering operations have been dismantled, and the group's reserves are tightening. Marcos's reply is firm. Diversify income sources immediately. Build new channels, but remain invisible. We must ensure the collective has enough to support members and communities through this storm. The week also brings better news. One update describes how PCC leaders in a distant region have successfully negotiated an alliance with a smaller local faction, stabilizing a previously volatile area. Marcos writes back with measured approval. Alliances must be tested, but unity makes us stronger. Do not forget that loyalty is earned, not assumed. He receives another coded letter from São Paulo that moves him deeply. Residents in the favelas have begun organizing quietly to resist state incursions, offering safe havens and resources to PCC members. The people remember who has stood by them, the letter says. Marcos folds it slowly, recognizing that this trust is the true foundation of their endurance. Yet not all news is uplifting. A young PCC member was killed during a raid, sparking anger among his peers. Some are calling for a violent reprisal. Marcos responds with clarity. We honor our brothers by preserving the collective, not by acting recklessly. Violence without purpose will only destroy what we have built. That night, as the prison grows quiet, Marcos reflects on how far they have come. He remembers the early days when the PCC was little more than an idea, born in the overcrowded cells of São Paulo, a response to a system that abandoned those it was meant to protect. Now, the organization stretches across Brazil, shaping lives and communities, feared by some, respected by others. Many people still think that the PCC's survival is guaranteed, but Marcos knows better. Every day brings new threats, new fractures, new tests of loyalty. Yet he also knows that their strength lies not in any single leader, but in the collective's ability to endure. he drafts one final letter for the week, addressed to the regional councils. Remember why we began. We are more than the sum of our members. We must outlast every storm, every crackdown, every betrayal. We endure not for power, but because the people we serve need us to endure. As he sets the letter aside to be smuggled out, Marcos lies back on his bunk, the thin mattress familiar against his back. He closes his eyes and imagines the streets of São Paulo, the bustling markets, the children laughing in alleyways, the families who rely on the PCC for protection and stability. The prison is silent now, save for the distant hum of the lights. Marcos whispers his mantra one last time, endure, and with that word, his thoughts soften, his breathing slows, and the darkness around him begins to fade into a gentler shade. He imagines the familiar sounds of the city, the distant rumble of buses, the soft rustle of wind through crowded neighborhoods, and lets the images carry him away. No matter what storms come, Marcos knows the PCC will continue to evolve, to adapt, to endure. And in that knowledge, there is a measure of peace. As we close this journey through São Paulo's shadowed corridors and prison cells, let your breath slow with each word. Picture the distant hum of the city fading into the background, replaced by a soft, steady rhythm, like the sound of waves brushing against a quiet shore. We've followed Marcos, the man known as Marcola, through a life shaped by hardship, strategy, and an unrelenting will to survive. His story is one of power built not only through force, but through loyalty and order in a world that too often denies both. Whether you see him as a criminal mastermind or a reluctant custodian of something larger, there's no denying the scale of what he's built and the weight of the choices he's had to make. Now, as the final images of São Paulo drift from your mind, imagine the streets settling into silence. The flicker of neon signs fades, the markets close, the children return home. Somewhere in a far-off prison cell, a man whispers the same word he's carried for decades. Endure. Let that word linger as you sink deeper into your pillow. Feel the tension melt from your shoulders, your chest rising and falling in an easy, even cadence. Whatever burdens you're carrying tonight, let them rest here, just for a while. The world can wait. Your breath is steady now. The room is quiet. The story has been told, and all that's left is a calm, endless night stretching before you. Sleep well, my friend. Sweet dreams.